Right. Right. Good evening, everyone. How are we all doing? Hope you've had a nice week. Let's see. We've got seven people. Mostly everyone joined our little quiz. I'll just give everyone 30 more seconds because I can see a few more people entering the session. How's everyone? Has everyone had a nice week? A few less of us. Right. I see a few thumbs up. That's good. Okay, right. How was my week? My week's been good. I've been on holiday, so my week's been very good. Um, Came back this morning, so I'm a bit all over the place, but good. Right. Okay, a few people entering the chat. Yeah, like always, you can join the Kahoot, the little quiz, midway through, so don't worry about it. Cool. Right, so turn the music on, and let's make a start. Cool. So this is going to be a little bit of revision, but kind of from what we did a little while ago. Some of the Gothic genre stuff, mostly sort of language analysis stuff, but a bit of a mixture of everything. So see how you do. Okay. The night was dark, was a dark velvet curtain. What kind of technique do we have here? It says it was a dark velvet curtain. Nice. Almost clean sweep. One person went for hyperbole, that would be exaggeration. I guess on some level it is a little bit exaggerated, but I was going for metaphor because it's comparing it to something else. He was as brave as a lion. What is that? Wow, quick queen sweep today. Again, hyperbole seems to be the one that's catching someone out. Hyperbole is exaggeration. And I guess on some level, I could understand the way of thinking here. Comparing someone to being a lion does seem a little bit exaggerated, a little bit abstract. Um, but because it's a comparison using as, it is a simile. Will all Great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? And I've highlighted Great Neptune's. What technique is that? Slightly more difficult. Oh, no one went for the right answer on this one. It is illusion. And the reason is I've highlighted the bit that you should be referring to. If you're referring to something or someone that everyone will know, it's illusion. It's like referring to something. So we see it a lot in like Shakespearean plays. Um, I could say I'm as mighty as Zeus. That would be illusion because I'm referring to Zeus, and we all know who that is, the Greek god. Same here, Neptune, the god of the ocean. In The Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield uses the term phony to describe people he dislikes. This is an example of. So think about the phony. What is that an example of? Is it an idiom, a euphemism, a colloquialism, or oxymoron? Ooh, a little bit of a split this time. It is colloquialism. It's the slang kind of language, language that is not formal, but informal. Like you wouldn't go into a workplace and call someone a phony. It's very much like a slang on the street term for the 1920s anyway. Okay, it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. What technique is that? I purposely not include juxtaposition here. Hey, it is anaphora. This is a lot of revision. This is the kind of techniques that we went through a few months ago. So I realized this is deep revision for us. But yeah, it's anaphora. It's the repetition of the start of clauses so that it was followed by it was. Okay, and the silken sad, uncertain rustling. What technique is that? Think about the silken sad, uncertain rustling. Is the sounds we're thinking about here. Oh, I knew this would catch people out. It's not alliteration because the sound continues throughout the sentence. I kind of see what people were thinking here with silken sad, but the sound continues past those words. So silken sad, uncertain, rustling. It's within the words themselves, not the beginning of words, so therefore it must be consonants. Very, very similar to alliteration. The body of the coach trembled, swayed, and rocked. Highlighted for you. Nice. Clean sweep on this one, rule of three. Okay, in Pride and Prejudice, characters refer to someone being in trade instead of saying they are merchants. This is. Okay, it is a euphemism. And if we think back, we did euphemisms a few months ago, and I think we did it in the same session as colloquialisms. Because a euphemism is like a softer way of saying something quite harsh. So almost a subdued way of saying something. So for example, if I said he passed away instead of he died, that would be a euphemism because it's a softer way of saying something. Okay, Sammy the slippery snake came sliding, and you've got your highlighted S's. Nice. Now that is alliteration because it's at the start of the words. We've got the repeated use of the same consonant, sound, and letter. So that one is alliteration. Okay. The lonely man sat in the corner, his eyes filled with sorrow. I've highlighted lonely and sorrow. Focus on those. In person, kind of on the edge on this one. Nice. It is emotive language. Yeah. It's words that are designed to make you feel a certain way to influence your emotions. Okay. I was so hungry I could eat a horse. Now, the person that was confused at the beginning is going to be having a field day with this question. Mhm. Nice. It's hyperbole. Yeah, came in handy, the knowledge of hyperbole on this one. Yeah, it's exaggeration. You couldn't literally eat a horse because it's so big, and you get full quite quickly, so therefore it's exaggeration. Something you can't literally do. Okay, the golden yellow of the leaves in the trees. Repetition spelt wrong there. Nice, it is imagery. If you can see it in your head, it is imagery. It's the kind of description that is designed to help you be able to envisage what's going on in a story. And that sort of detailed level of description here lets you do that. Okay, the river smacked and splashed against the rocks. Nice. It is technically both. I let you have this on this occasion because I've used both. It is onomatopoeia because you've got those sounds that are descriptive, and you've also got the alliteration of the double S usage. So very nice. Okay, the leaves danced in the wind. What is this? Can leaves literally dance? Might help you with the answer on this one. Nice. Almost clean sweep again. It's personification. If you're giving objects very human-like qualities, we call that personification. And leaves can't literally dance in the wind, but humans can. Okay, blood will have blood. Remember back to Macbeth on this one. Lovely. It's repetition because we've got the repeated use of the word blood. Okay. Are you a man? Simple, simple, simple. Oh, that was a speedy one. Nice. It is a rhetorical question. Hopefully, it should be obvious. There's a question mark in there. Okay. In the Lord of the Rings, the One Ring might symbolize what? Think way back to our work on symbolism for this one. Nice. It is power. Yeah, anyone who owns the ring has power. Okay, cabined, cribbed, confined, bound are all words within which semantic field? So groups of words. Think about how you could group them all together into one theme. It is entrapment. So because you confine something, bind it, crib it, it means to basically ensnare or to trap something. Oh, we've got a solid lead this time. This is good. Second week in a row. Nice. Harry walked wearily. Bit more of a difficult one here. I've highlighted the consonants that I want you to, and the vowels that I want you to look at here. The clue here is vowel sounds. Nice, it is assonance. So if consonance is the repetition of consonant sounds, assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds. Two contrasting ideas is an example of what? So think of light versus dark, life versus death, um, good versus evil. Nice, it's juxtaposition. If you get any contrasting things, we call it juxtaposition. Okay, that's almost at the end now. Deafening silence. Another example of contrast, but a slightly different version of contrast. Nice, it's an oxymoron. When you have two contrasting words or opposite words next to each other in a description. So silence cannot literally be deafening because silence means there's no sound, but it can figuratively be deafening. Okay. Peter pounded the pavement, pressing past pedestrians. What type of Lexus is this? Think about phonetics. I probably should have said phonetics. We have our repeated P consonants here. Remember back to our sounds. This is a while ago. It's good revision. It is plosive. Plosive sounds are P's, our D's, our B's, our G's. Yeah, very nice. All the ones that are sort of hard hitting, high energy sounds. Okay, what word means to stay longer than necessary? I've thrown in a definition just for revision. Need to keep revising our keywords. Good to learn some new words. I should start doing this more. You know what? That's reminded me. I'm going to start throwing in some more new words. Okay, five more. What does darkness usually symbolize in Gothic fiction? So we didn't do this that long ago. See what you can remember from this. Okay. Most people, yeah, I would have allowed either fear or the unknown. Um, yeah, darkness tends to sort of represent repressed ideas, I guess, in Gothic fiction. Okay, so in Freudian terms, what did the id represent in Gothic fiction? This will really solidify who's been revising, who's been putting in the work, because it's a bit more of a higher level thing, concept. Nice. Three people have it. It's our instinctual desires. So think about Jekyll and Hyde, for example. The id could be said to be representative of Hyde, the sort of vicious, aggressive side of humanity. It's the bits that we repress, kind of like caveman instincts, the need to destroy the violence. Why was the, let's say, idea of the Victorian gentleman especially suited to Gothic horror? How were the Victorians seen? How did they view themselves? Why is that a great thing to use in Gothic literature? Nice. Yeah, they were expected to hide emotion. It was definitely prevalent at the time that Victorian men were just expected to hold themselves high, act with confidence, act with valor. And they were often expected just to repress all of the sort of sinful desires. And so the Gothic genre plays on that because it knows that it's hard to keep those desires down. And so, for example, like Jekyll and Hyde explores what happens when the Victorian gentleman represses those desires for too long and it ends up coming out as a violent, aggressive rage. Okay, what did we say was an allegory or an allegory? Nice. Yeah, it's a story where the characters or the events symbolize the sort of deeper ideas. So I think I gave you the example of the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It's a poem where the sailor shoots the bird or the albatross, and that's representative of sinful behaviors. Okay, and then finally, what is an epistolic structure? I'll have to skip on this one. Nice. It is a story. Oh, only one person got this. It's a story told through letters, diaries, or documents. So, for example, Dracula is a great example of this because it's told entirely through diary entries. Even the last two chapters of Jekyll and Hyde are told through letter format. So, if a character writes down their thoughts and their feelings in a letter or a diary, that is epistolic. Right, let's see. I think I know who's won on this one. Is it 2 weeks on the trot for this one? We've got a theme starting. Nice. Let's make it 3 weeks in a row next week, shall we? We should start a leaderboard, shouldn't we? Right. Okay. So, we looked last week, if you remember back. Seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? Um, we looked through this idea of how to write speeches and what makes a good speech. And I think we looked at um, the requirements for a GCSE exam. Obviously, it's a little early for you guys, but it was good just getting ahead of the necessary requirements. Um, I very quickly want to jump back a step and think about persuasion in general, because we talked about purpose in nonfiction writing. And persuasion is just one of the purposes of writing, but it's quite a big one because it comes into a lot of, I guess, reasoning as to why you'd write a nonfiction text. Now, thinking about it literally, persuasion means to thoroughly sweeten something. It comes from Latin and it means to thoroughly sweeten. So, kind of like how you would add sugar to cake and biscuits to make them taste nicer, you can kind of think about doing that with your writing as well. And there are certain things that we've talked about and that we will talk about that help you just to make something a little bit more appealing for the reader. So you might have heard the phrase to sugarcoat something, basically means to make something seem a bit nicer so that people don't get, I guess, as offended by it or take it a bit nicer. We can do the same with writing. We can think about writing as sugarcoating because we want people to accept our point of view. If we're trying to persuade someone, if we're trying to persuade someone, we want someone to agree with our side of the argument. So we might use certain techniques to sugarcoat in order to sort of butter them up a little bit, in other words. So why do we actually persuade someone? Well, we do it to change their mind. Humans have this instinct to want to be right. And so we'll often use persuasive devices in order to try and get someone on our side. And writing is no different. And we can utilize that across different industries. So if we think about different forms of persuasion, can anyone can anyone think of any sort of different forms of non-fiction writing in real life, in exam form, where you'd use persuasion to get what you want or to get your point across? Any ideas? Jargon is a good example of technique, less so form, but is a really good example of technique. Letter is a great one. Yeah, I think that's on here somewhere. I don't want to press too soon, but letter is a great example of one. Speeches is a great example of another. Things like posters and advertising. The classic one for with the I Want You for the US Army. You see it on TV all the time. You know, your big brands will try and entice you to buy their products. That's persuasion. You find it in newspaper articles and just general online articles all the time. Um, Designing leaflets is a great example of persuasion because you want somebody to come and partake in your business. So all of these things use persuasion to kind of get the customer or to get someone on their side. Now, I wanted to go over that very briefly because today I thought we'd look at something slightly different. When you kind of get to GCSE and even higher, argumentative writing becomes a lot more prevalent or common in terms of academic writing. Um, we tend to use arguments a lot more than we would use other forms of non-fiction writing, and it's slightly different to the forms that we have been looking at. So I guess I wanted to make it clear that arguments don't refer to disagreements. I'm not talking about a shouting argument match. I'm talking about a well-structured point of view. So I'm not talking about conflict. I'm talking about um, trying to get somebody in a written form to agree with our point of view. So as part of arguments, they're actually balanced. And a lot of the non-fiction we've looked at recently have been not balanced. For example, we looked at letters. You write to somebody because you want them to do something for you. You write speeches because you want to try and get the audience to agree with you and your opinions. Whereas an argument is more balanced than other forms. And what I mean by that is it includes the alternative viewpoints other than just your own opinion. So it involves us giving some form of counter argument in addition to our argument. So you'll have a general argument that runs through what you believe in, but then it's also good practice to bring up counter arguments. And you'll see what I mean. We're going to look through an example of a good quality argument. So it shows the reader that you've considered all sides before reaching a conclusion. So, for example, if I was writing an argument about do I agree that phones should be allowed in the classroom? Well, on one side, my personal opinion might be no, but I'd also have to consider the reasons for yes. That would make a good argument. I wouldn't just be ruling out the other side. Is the difference here? So, arguments versus persuasion both aim to influence, both must be convincing, but arguments rely much more heavily on facts and reasoning rather than emotional appeal that we have been looking at. Like if you're writing a letter, you're going to want to try and appeal to emotions because that's what manipulates the person. But an argument is much more balanced, much more fact and reason heavy. So arguments persuade in a slightly different way to other texts. And a good example of this is just looking at their style, how they're written. For arguments, we tend to use third person. So that's our he, she, they, rather than our I and we. And the reason that is it just keeps it nice and formal. So we need to use a formal tone, something that's not slang based, no jokes, no casual language. And the reason that is because it makes your writing appear what we call objective. In other words, accurate, unbiased, and even professional. So it helps to avoid bias because the writer is presenting evidence and reasoning, not personal opinion. So it makes your argument more convincing almost because it seems more trustworthy than listening to someone's speech or letter with their opinion in. That makes sense. So keep it third person, keep it formal because that's what makes it convincing by using those facts. So, for example, students benefit from school uniforms because they encourage equality, instead of, I think students benefit from school uniforms. Just the wording of that is a lot more trustworthy than giving my personal opinion. Like, why would you trust a randomer when you can trust facts and statistics that are achieved by professionals? Okay. So how would you actually build an argument? Well, I created a little step-by-step plan. The first thing that I would do is start with a clear main point. What do you actually believe? What is your standpoint in the issue? And this is where you should begin. So always open by stating what you believe. So, for example, testing products on animals is absolutely wrong for both moral and environmental reasons. So that's telling me, as the audience, I know where the speaker stands. I know that's what they believe. However, you need to support each point in separate paragraphs. So, for example, you might have a first line where you introduce a supporting idea, and then you might support that with the facts, the evidence, and the explanations. So, kind of similar to how in English language you do point, evidence, explain. So, you make a point, you back it up with some evidence, give a little bit of explanation. So, for example, it is now less acceptable than ever to test cosmetics on animals. Indeed, in March 2013, a new European law was passed that made it illegal to sell cosmetics in the EU that have been tested on animals. This suggests that most people in today's society have a moral objection. So, kind of see the point evidence explained there. They've made a point that is less acceptable. They've given some evidence with some statistics, well, rather, one fact. And then they've given a little bit of explanation that they think blah, 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 blah. So kind of point evidence explain. I would then just keep supporting as many points as you can. Because the more evidence and examples you have, the more facts, the more statistics, the stronger your argument is, because you've got more to back up what you're saying. And then I'd end with a clear conclusion. So summarize all of those main points, reinforce the main idea, but do not repeat it word for word. So for example, due to the harmful effect of testing products on animals and the damage it inflicts on the environment, we must oppose animal testing. Again, this is a good psychological technique. If you kind of circle back and begin and end where you've begun, then it's like a hard hitter to the audience, just reminding them of that belief that you gave them at the beginning. Just to kind of remind them where you stand. It's a nice psychological tactic. So I'd end with a clear conclusion that mimics or reflects the beginning. Okay. So when we're thinking about supporting evidence, then um, it's important to provide evidence for every statement that you give. You can't give a fact without giving evidence because then it makes those facts questionable. Because then the reader or the audience is thinking, where did they get that information from? Is it correct? So every claim you make needs facts, examples, or statistics. That's what makes it trustworthy. So, for example, school uniforms help students feel part of a team. In fact, a 2020 survey of 2,000 students found that 78% said uniforms made them feel included and equal. So, what they've done is they've given a statement and they've backed it up with some evidence. Also, make sure that evidence is relevant. So, when you're writing an argument, don't start giving some random evidence that has nothing to do with the argument itself. Um, because then it just makes your argument seem silly, like you can't back it up with facts. So, evidence must always directly support your point, just to make it trustworthy, believable. For example, the survey above links directly to the idea that uniforms create a sense of belonging. So they've used a very, very, very highly relevant um, fact and statistic to back up their quote. Let's see. Um, Also, yeah, it's not to date. So um, make sure that your evidence is, I guess I should have added this as a really good point, actually. If you're going to use evidence, make sure it's up to date. I mean, this doesn't really necessarily apply to you guys for exams because we don't test that kind of thing. But it's a good point that when you get to like A level and university, when you're using sources, make sure that you're using up to date ones because they're more trustworthy. And the reason is because science is changing all the time. So what might have been true 10 years ago might have been disproven or um, a new theory might have been made since then. So always try and use newer, better sources because they're better, more reliable. How is deafening silence um, an oxymoron and oxymorons actually contrast? So it's an oxymoron because an oxymoron is two words next to each other that cannot literally be together. They literally are opposites of each other. So, for example, silence cannot literally be deafening. Silence literally means no noise. But deafening means the opposite. It means that there's a really, really loud noise. So literally that can make sense. But on a figurative, metaphoric level, that does work. So if something is deafening, it's literally loud, but it could also metaphorically or figuratively mean that it's like painful. So it's inferring that the silence is painful rather than being physically loud, if that makes sense. So it's more on a metaphoric level. That's why it's an oxymoron. Explain your evidence as well. Yeah, don't just give the facts, also say why they matter, link them back to your subject matter. So this shows that uniforms can reduce feelings of exclusion and bullying, helping students focus on learning instead of comparing clothes. So, I said before, the difference between a persuasive piece and a argument is that it's balanced. That an argument is balanced. In other words, it is unbiased. We've covered biased a lot over the past couple of weeks or so, and an argument is unbiased. You might have your own personal opinion, but that shouldn't come across too heavily in an argument. You should always consider the other side of the argument. So you can't just explain why your view is correct. You must also consider other viewpoints. And I must note, it doesn't make it any less persuasive by doing that. In fact, it makes it more persuasive because it shows how fair your argument is, how credible it is, how trustworthy. By acknowledging different viewpoints, you show how the reader that you've thought carefully. This makes your argument more trustworthy than one that ignores other opinions. Because, like, if you've done your research and then come to the conclusion, That shows that your argument is more trustworthy than just randomly spurting opinions. They strengthen your main point. Yeah, explaining why opposing views are less convincing makes your argument more logical and solid. So again, if you've done the research and there's a maybe a study that is against your argument, if you can say why that study is bad, then it makes your argument look more credible because you're like, okay, well, I'm disproving the other one. So it's always good. They appeal to the reader's reason. So balanced arguments are use facts, evidence, reasoning, not just opinion. So they don't just rely on emotion. Readers are more likely to agree with someone who considers all sides, because again, you've taken into account the whole story, not just randomly, blindly made an opinion. And then finally, it's more persuasive. Just like persuasive writing, a balanced argument influences the reader as it convinces them through logic, fairness, and evidence, not just emotions. I personally prefer arguments to other persuasive pieces of writing. I personally think they're easier. Because when you've done the research, you can come to your own conclusions about a topic based on that research. And I think other persuasive pieces rely a lot on emotion and trying to like manipulate the reader or the audience. But arguments don't do that. They're not really manipulative. They're more thorough, I guess. Right. What's the difference between argument and a debate? They're very similar. Um, a debate is between two people is really the only difference. So if you went into a debate and I believed one thing and another person believed the opposite, then we could have a verbal discussion about it and debate it. Whereas an argument is more written by one person and you've got your opinions, but you are also considering the other side. Whereas in a debate, you don't really consider the other side because it's more just like the other person who you're debating against is the other side. It's kind of the difference, if that makes sense. It's just important to consider counter arguments as part of that. So, what I mean by counter argument is when you acknowledge the opposite opinion. So, for example, again, if I said, I don't believe phones should be in the classroom, the opposite opinion, the counter argument would be, yes, they should be allowed in the classroom. So, it's the opposite opinion. And then you challenge that opinion with reasons and evidence to show why you are correct and why the counter argument is less convincing. So, for example, supporters of homework say it helps students learn better. The counter argument of that would be, however, studies show that excessive homework can increase stress and reduce time for revision, meaning homework does not always improve learning. So that's a study or a fact that counters and opposes the argument, just considering the other side. So this works because it makes your entire argument more comprehensive, more strong. So it shows the reader that you thought carefully about the issue, you've not just blindly made an opinion. So, as a very brief interactive activity, then, I've got three different statements, and I want you to think about what the counter arguments could be, the opposite ones. So, school uniforms should be compulsory for all students. Is there anything you could say here that might give a counter argument to this statement? Any ideas? So, yes, I guess the opposite view would be that they are not or they shouldn't be compulsory for all students. But why? Any ideas as to it makes the school one family. Oh, I like that. It's a nice way of thinking about it as family. So they should be compulsory because it makes them family. What about the counter argument? Why maybe shouldn't they be compulsory for all students? Why do you disagree? Any reason why? They're uncomfortable. Yeah, that could be a counter argument. That maybe there's a study that says, I don't know, 80% of students found that the school uniform was ill-fitting and therefore uncomfortable. Cost is another great one, another good counter argument. Any more? You can't show your true colors, lack of identity. I love it. So yeah, this is what I went for. Just some examples. Uniforms can be expensive, cost. According to a 2019 report, Some families spend over £300 a year per child on uniforms. This can be a financial burden, especially for low-income households. So yeah, they may limit self-expression. So someone said can't show your true colors, which is important for developing individuality and confidence. And then also, the uniforms are pointless. They don't reduce bad behavior. They don't control students. Um, Easy to be ruined is a good one as well. Black uniforms attract heat from the sun. Lovely. Yeah, these are all great counter arguments. So let's do another one real quick. Zoos are good for education and conservation. Is there any alternative arguments to why they might not be good for education and conservation? You all did so well on that one. Let's do another one. Animals are ill-treated is a great one. Yeah, yeah, maybe the animals aren't kept properly. That's a great counter argument. Might affect the animals' emotions and habits. Absolutely right. Yeah, great one. They can scare the children and make them worried is a great one as well. They feel trapped and want to be freed. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that this is wrong. I'm just saying this is an example. Personally, I don't agree with zoos. Now, I don't mind if you do. That's up to you and your personal beliefs. Um, you might like it so much you leave important. So much you might leave. You, how much you leave. Okay. All right, fine. Trap might be free. Okay, this is what I said. So yeah, a lot of I think this was said. Um, it's bad for the animal's habits and emotions. Yeah, some of the zoos don't replicate the wild conditions that the animals would normally live, so it can stress the animals out. For example, elephants in captivity may live less than half as long as them in the wild, purely because the conditions are different in zoos than they would be in the wild. So, visiting zoos may not truly educate people about animal behavior, as captive animals often behave differently. There's other great ones there as well. Okay, we'll do one more because you're smashing this. Well done, guys. So, fast food restaurants should be banned near schools. Is there any reason why they maybe shouldn't be banned near schools? Any ideas? Let's see. Schools can be reliant on them. What do you mean reliant? So I think yeah, that's a good point, but let's clarify. Kids get hungry. They can make children only think about food and not studies. These are some good ones. Children, for example, might be hungry and their houses are far away. Yeah, that's a great one. Anything else? Okay, I'll show you what I said. If there's nothing, I might walk home. I went with these. So banning restaurants may not actually stop unhealthy eating, for example, as students can still purchase the same sort of junk food at home or elsewhere. Maybe I think somebody said that they rely on the schools rely on them. Well, certainly maybe the sort of council relies on them. Fast food businesses employ many people, so banning them could harm the local economy. According to this statistic, the food service industry employs over 1.5 million people in the UK alone. So yeah, you could talk about the fact that getting rid of those would ruin the economy by taking away local business costs. Cheap people can go there, even though it could affect health. You had a long day, you can go there, even if your parents could work. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying again, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Just these are just examples, but good. Um, so before we look at a good example, there's a few more things to go through. When you're writing an argument, a good thing to do is to signpost the reader. And you'll be very familiar with this with other types of writing. But we call them discourse markers. They're basically just words used to help guide the reader through your writing. And you'll be familiar with most of these, I would hope. So, for example, if you're writing an argument that's like for your argument, you might say like additionally, furthermore, in addition, likewise, moreover. If you're writing about a point that's opposing your argument, you might say, alternatively, by contrast, in contrast, nevertheless, on the other hand, whereas. So it's always good to use discourse markers just because it guides the reader quite nicely. It makes it a bit clearer as well for the examiner reading. You don't want to get the audience or reader confused, so it's always good to just segue into next sections. Um, Equally, we could talk a little bit about persuasive language. Um, I didn't really cover this as much last time, but we've looked a lot at different techniques of writing. So I'm not going to go into those too significantly today, but something I do want to mention is this guy here. Many of you might have heard of the Greek philosopher Aristotle. He's famous for many things, but one of them is his idea about persuasion. And he declared that there's three types of ways that you could persuade somebody. So one of them is through ethos, which means value and trust. So if you get the audience to trust you, they're more likely to be on your side. So for example, um, you could do this by demonstrating that you understand their perspective, the counter arguments. So, for example, as a teacher, I know how important it is for students to have time to rest, is a good counter argument. Secondly, you might consider pathos, like emotions. So, appeal to the feelings of the reader or the audience, make them feel angry, happy, guilty, inspired, scared. So, for example, imagine how lonely a child must feel without a pet to love. And then thirdly, you could use logos. So this is our logic and reasoning. So use facts, statistics, logical arguments. For example, recycling 1 ton of paper saves 17 trees and 7,000 gallons of water. So build the audience's trust, play on their emotions, and use facts, statistics, and logic to get them on side. Yes, pathos, ethos, and logos. Um, and then we've covered persuasive devices before. But I came across, I didn't realize this existed, and I came across this, and I thought it was really useful to share with you. A good way of remembering persuasive devices is through this mnemonic here, and it's helpfully persuader. So, pronouns, emotive language, repetition, statistics, undermining the opposition, anecdote, direct address, exaggeration, rhetorical questions. So I just thought I'd share that with you really quickly, because it's a good way of remembering the rhetoric, the devices that we've been through recently. So very quickly, before we have a brief look at a good example of an argument, um, thinking about statistics and facts. We discussed that facts make your argument more credible and convincing. They show that your opinion is based on evidence, not just emotion. So it's good to show the scale and the seriousness of an issue. But when you choose them, make sure to choose them effectively. We kind of discussed this earlier, but make sure they're relevant, make sure they link to your points. But most importantly, don't fall into this trap of overloading your writing with just facts and figures. Because it's useful to use lots of them because it's more convincing. But also you don't want to overwhelm the reader and make them not want to read anymore because it's just too full of facts and figures. So I think one or two per point is enough. And I would introduce them naturally. So don't try and force them in. Just try and weave them in where they're relevant. So for example, according to a 2022 report, so on and so on. And then finally, same thing applies to emotive language. Use it sparingly. It's great to use emotive language because it manipulates and influences the feelings of the reader. But also don't shove them in there. Don't shove them down the reader's throats because then they're not going to want to read on because they're going to think like, why is this guy like trying to force me to feel a certain way? So don't overuse them because it limits their impact if you overuse them. Um, One of the things that makes them so good is using them not as common or using them sparingly, because then they have a harder impact when they are used. And always try and combine them with facts and reasoning. just so you don't sound too opinion based or too um, dramatic. That makes sense. And I think about the connotations. So, for example, certain words will have certain associations. We talked about connotations before. Um, so I think about those, but I do very quickly want to move on to an example. So I'm going to quickly read through this, and whilst I'm reading through, think about what is good about this argument example. Put your answer in the chat, what you think is good about it. Also consider what might need improvement. Have a bit of think. So, as online learning becomes more common and more resources are converted to digital form, some people have suggested that public libraries should shut down and in their place, everyone should be given an iPad with an e-reader subscription. Proponents of this idea state that it will save local cities and towns money because libraries are expensive to maintain. They also believe it will encourage more people to read because they won't have to travel to a library to get a book. They can simply click on what they want to read and read it wherever they are. They can also access more materials because libraries won't have to buy physical copies of books. They can simply rent out as many digital copies as they need. However, it would be a serious mistake to replace libraries with tablets. First, digital books and resources are associated with less learning and more problems than print resources. A study done on tablet versus book reading found that people read 20 to 30% slower on tablets and retain 20% less information, and understand 10% less of what they read compared to what they read the same information in print. Additionally, staring too long at the screen has been shown to cause numerous health problems, including blurred vision, dizziness, dry eyes, headache, and eye strain, at much higher instances than reading print does. People who use tablets and mobile devices excessively also have a higher incidence of more serious health issues such as shoulder and back pain, carpal tunnel syndrome, and muscle strain. I know that whatever I read from my ebook for too long, my eyes begin to feel tired and my neck hurts. We should not press or add to these problems by giving people, especially young people, more reason to look at screens. Yes, course passed. Okay, is there anything that's good or maybe needs improvement from this? Fibromyalgia is a disease. Yeah. Anything good? Add facts about the iPads using the percentage of people. Yeah, we could do that. We could definitely add a fact in there or some statistic about iPad use. It's definitely something that could strengthen the argument. Is there anything else that they've done quite well? It's not the full argument. I haven't actually finished, but just for time's sake, is there anything good in this section? When you get the full presentation, it will have all my notes on here, so you'll see the full thing. Good list of the issues. I agree. I think they've got a really nice, strong, argumentative support down here. They've used a lot of studies um, to support the point that they're making. They're saying that I recognize the other side of the argument. However, here is the evidence and the receipts to back up my argument. So they talked about one study here, and then they backed it up with a second study. Great use of evidence um, to really hammer home the point. Absolutely. Anything else that they've done well, do you think? Or maybe not so well? I definitely think there's a strong use of evidence. There's definitely a clear structure here. Statistics, absolutely. I think it's somewhat is engaging as well. I think maybe what they could do differently is, for example, down here they used an anecdote. Because this is an argument and not a speech, I'd maybe say remove that anecdote so that it's not as personal, it's not as opinion based, and it's more factual based. I'd maybe, yeah, remove that anecdote from down there. Anything else that people noticed or? Think about like the studies as well. I'd maybe check the accuracy and the dates of the studies as well, just to make sure that the information you're giving is correct. Next time they should add what to do to stop the issues. Yeah, I'm not sure if they do in the end. I actually don't think they do, so I think that's a good point. I definitely think we could add um, what they want out of this argument, what they want the end result to be, is definitely a great point. Yeah, so I went with this. I think like great things, good counter arguments, good strong use of evidence, good clear structure, and it's definitely engaging. However, I would maybe improve the removal of anecdotes so that it's not as opinionated. I'd make sure to check the accuracy of the claims. Um, I'd also maybe to expand on certain examples, um, because they could definitely include more detailed cases. Um, and yeah, just variety of paragraphs. Like there's a very like dense paragraph down here, and I know I didn't show you this, but not so dense later on. So maybe try and even out the paragraph lengths just so it's a bit more readable. But they did use those discourse markers. They used, however, additionally, um, I think they used more in there as well. So yeah, they used some good discourse markers as well. Right. What we will do is I will give you this week's homework. I've given you a second example in the presentation, so I'll upload these slides and you have access to them to see on my notes, just so you get an idea of what makes a good and a bad argument. Um, but yeah, so I'll give you those to have. Um, so in terms of this week's homework, then, um, I'm tasking you to write a one-page argument responding to this statement here. Mobile phones should be banned in schools. I want you to consider your viewpoint as well as the counter arguments. Think about maybe facts, examples, statistics to back up the points that you're making. Try and include at least one counter argument and try and explain why it is less convincing. And also try and use that formal tone and third person as my task to you. And what I haven't added, which I will actually add down here, is the email. I always forget to add the email. So it is English at step to success.co.uk. So yeah, if you feel like sending anything, and you want me to mark anything, send it to this email down here. Otherwise, have a lovely week, Key Stage 3. Um, yeah, and that's us done. And as always, you're welcome to stay for GCSE for the Key Stage 4 stuff. And I'll stay around for a couple of minutes in case anyone's got any questions, or any ideas of things you want me to go through in the next few weeks. Because I'm always open to ideas. If there are things that you're struggling with, please bring them to me because, yeah, that's what we're here for. Could we do some poetry? That's a good idea. Let me write that down. I'm gonna write that down because I do think poetry is a good one. Um, we won't do any specific poems because yeah, everyone does different poems. But what we could do is some very general poetry skills or how to analyze poetry. So I put poetry analysis as a unseen. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think that'd be really useful for unseen. Um, yeah, going through how to analyze poems in general, and that you could definitely apply to your unseen. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Really good idea. I will do that. I will do that next. Thanks for the help, guys. Cool. Right. I'm assuming key stage 4 are on their way in. So, I will leave you with a little starter, um, today. No Kahoot for the Key Stage 4 GCSE. I just haven't had time. Sorry, guys. I've literally been on holiday and I got back this morning, so I've literally not had time to make much for today. So, AO1 starter. And I'm going to leave you with this for a couple of minutes. Put your answers in the chat, see what you come up with for this AO1 starter. Remember, AO1 is just simply selecting evidence and quotes from the text. So it doesn't need to be anything complicated. Literally just Very short statements of fact in answer to this question, and I will leave you this with the starter for a couple of minutes. Right. Okay. Um, What do people think for this starter then? Welcome in to people who just joined us, by the way. I left this little starter on, this little AO1 starter. Hopefully, it should be revision because it's simple AO1 skills. And we have covered this very recently. Any ideas in the chat? Four things about the old man from this part of the source. We're just looking for factual, short bits of information. So, right off the bat, he's old. Absolutely. He was an old man. He fished alone is definitely one. I'd actually split those that you've given. I think he fished alone is a separate fact to the he fished in a skiff would be a separate fact, or what would be allowed in an exam to be a separate fact. Um, Anymore, he had gone 84 days without taking a fish is a great one. He fished with a boy for 40 days. Brilliant. 4 out of 4. Um, he fished in a skiff in a Gulf Stream. That's a bit of a tongue twister. Absolutely right. Yep, same ones, same ones. Brilliant. Yeah, you can have quite a few from these. Normally, in these types of questions, they give you options. Normally, there's like 10 different options of things you can have. So, firstly, he was an old man. Second, he fished alone. Third, he fished in a skiff. Fourth, he fished in the Gulf Stream. Fifth, he had gone 84 days without taking a fish. Sixth, in the first 40 days, a boy had been fishing with him. Um, then you could even put, as another one, after 40 days, the boy went home to his parents or left the old man. Another one, the old man was unlucky. Um, yeah, I think there's probably 8 there you could pick from. Nice. Okay. I just thought I'd remind ourselves. I keep practicing the skills that we've already worked on because they're easy. If you remember back, AO1 is like 10% of exams, so always good practice. Now we have been looking at structure recently, and I talked you through it's not the language, the structural devices that are great for those sort of extract questions. But every single exam will have a whole text question, no matter the exam board. The difference is that AQA has a question that is focused solely on structure, whereas the other exam boards still have the whole text question, but it's not just structure, it'll also be in combination with language. Either way, the skills and what's required is exactly the same for every exam board. So today I thought we'd start looking at some of the other structural devices that you can start talking about with the whole text question. So when we think about structure, The key question here is what changes? What has changed from the beginning of the text to the end of the text? And that could be any one of these things here. I'll do them one by one. Who? So when we think about a whole text, we need to consider the five W's. Who, what, why, where, and when. Who? Who is the narrator? Who's talking? Whose perspective is the story from? Who is introduced and when? How are they described? How do we meet them? How are we made to feel about them? What? What's the narrative structure? What's actually happening in the story? What's the order of events? What's the paragraph structure like? What's the sentence structure like? Where? Where is our story actually set? How is the setting described? Does that setting change? When? When's the story set? When time-wise does the story take place? Even on the story arc, which we'll cover later, when is our story? When are new ideas or characters introduced? Is there a time change? Is there a flashback? And then all of that combines into why. Why are all of these changes actually important? Because structure is important. Structure conveys so much to a reader. So, what impact do all of these changes have on the reader's experience of that story? Because that's really what's being asked of you in the exam. Why has the writer made the choices that they've made? How is the reader supposed to be affected by those changes? So, just to remind you, we have extract and whole text questions. We've looked at those extract questions. Now we're going to look at the whole text. And it's worth noting that some structural devices are more suitable for the extract questions, others are suited to the whole text. And we looked at the ones for the extract before, the ones that are more sentence based. Now, for whole, these are the ones that are more important. So, things like narration, who's talking, the perspective and the attitude of who's talking, the introduction to new characters. Do any new people come into our story midway through? The story arc. Where are we on the story arc? Setting. In media res, we'll cover that later as well. Order of events, the narrative type, changes in time, things like flashbacks, flash forwards, and then even changes of focus. So the whole text question is more focused on narrative-based changes than on the smaller sentence level changes that the extract is. However, you can still talk about those sentence level changes. You can talk about the listing, you can talk about repetition, but they're more focused on these ones. So these are really good terms that will get you high level marks in an exam. So let's start talking our way through these. And I guess I added this in to remind myself, is that there are a lot of possible structural devices. And it's like language devices. There are loads to choose from. It does not mean that you need to include them all in the exam. Just choose the ones that are relevant to the question and don't overload your answer with devices. Because I'm giving you loads here. Doesn't mean you have to use all of them. Doesn't even mean you have to remember all of them. If we're talking about exams, 3 to 4 structural devices is absolutely fine and it will get you a good mark. It's inspiration, not a goal. So don't think you need to know every single one that I've ever given you because these are all just inspiration. Now, if you want to go learn them all, cool. That's great. That's actually really good because then you'll give yourself a higher chance of being able to recognize a wider range of structural devices in the exam and you'll give yourself more to talk about. But you don't need to. Um, it's worth saying. So, firstly, then, let's consider the question of who. Who is talking? When we're talking about a narrator, we're talking about how the story is told. From whose perspective is the story being told? So, you can break this down into 2 categories, first person and third person. First is I, me, my, that sort of thing. Third person is we, they. And there's a difference, and we'll cover these. Let me see what's been put in the chat. Can I go back to the whole spider diagram? Yeah? Sure. You'll get these, by the way. I think I mentioned this last week, but all of these PowerPoints have been uploaded onto the system for you to access, by the way. Okay, so who is talking? The narrator. Um, First person can be subdivided into two more sections, protagonist and witness. Let's start with protagonist. I've given a good example of protagonist is someone like Holden Caulfield in The Catcher of the Rye. So this is when the story is told by the main character. So it creates quite an intimate, personal, and deep connection between the reader and the protagonist. And this is such a good type of narration because we're following the main character throughout the journey. And so we get all of their thoughts, all of their emotions, all of their struggles. We begin to understand the main character like the back of our own hand. And we begin to form that intimate connection with them because of that understanding. So it's a really positive type of narration to use. However, it is limited because we do only get one side of the story. If we're only following one person in a story, then we're not going to experience the other sides of the arguments, kind of like we just did in Key Stage 3. Um, so yeah, it has its limitations. But as a type of narration, first person protagonist is great because we really get to grips with the thoughts and the feelings of the characters that we're following. So yeah, it really creates this intimate connection. Now, the difference between protagonist and witness is that witness is when the story is told by an observer of events. So protagonist is when we follow the main character. The witness is not the main character. They are just someone else in the story. So they might be just watching from the outside, for example, or they could be part of the story. So while the narrator provides insight into what they see and hear, they don't have access to the internal thoughts or motivations of the main characters, leading to a more partial and sometimes unreliable understanding. And a good example of that is like Dr. Watson um, in the Sherlock Holmes franchise. Dr. Watson is the sidekick of Sherlock Holmes. He's not the main character, but he's in the story and just kind of like watching. Sherlock Holmes is the main character. So that would be an example of first person witness. And the positives of having something like that is that it does add a sense of mystery. Because as a reader, you're kind of left to interpret certain things without being directly told something. So first person protagonist is great because you're told everything. You know everything. Whereas first person witness is kind of limited because you don't really know that much about the main characters. Equally, or rather oppositely, you get a third person. So this is when you get like the they, he, she, that sort of thing. And we can split this down as well, omniscient and limited. Omniscient is like all knowing. So this is a type of narrator that knows everything in the story. So kind of think of like a godlike presence. They know all the characters, they know all the characters' thoughts, all the feelings, all the motivations, and they know everything that's happening in the story. So this provides a very comprehensive view of the plot, allowing the reader to understand the motivations of each character, as well as learn information beyond what each character knows individually. So the reader is presented the full picture, not the fill, the full picture, but without the emotional intimacy of the first person perspective. So a good example of that is like Harry Potter. We know or we follow like all the characters, not just one character. And so we kind of get to know all the characters. We know what's going on all of the time. Nice and simple. Whereas third person limited is when the story is only told from one person or about one person. So still the narrator knows like everything, but they only know everything about that one character. So the story is still told by an observer of events, but only from the viewpoint of one character, allowing the readers to know only the emotions and thoughts of that character. This enhances emotional connection and allows for a deeper understanding of the protagonist's personal journey. However, the reader is restricted to this character's perspective and doesn't have access to the inner lives of other characters. And so it's a limited knowledge, but it does give suspense. It's Christmas Carol, first person witness or third person? Christmas Carol's, I don't want to say this because I've got actually got a question on this later. I will keep that to myself. Well, you'll get your answer, I promise, but there's a reason I'm not giving it right now. Um, is Harry Potter peak? Bro, you never seen Harry Potter? Watch Harry Potter. They're so good. They're so good. So yeah, a good example of third person limited is like Game of Thrones. Gets told through the perspectives of different characters, and you follow just those characters out of the stories. Okay. I'll skip reliable. No, I'll go through reliable and unreliable. I will. Um, so third person limited. Sorry, someone said, can I explain third person limited with an example? So I'm trying to think of another example of third person limited. Third person is like when you're basically a fly on the wall. You're witnessing all the events that are going on in a story, um, except it's only one person. So, for example, I know Harry Potter is omniscient, but let's take Harry Potter as an example. Imagine that we only followed Harry throughout the story. And we never cut to any of the other characters. Now, if you've read the Harry Potter books, you'll know that we learn everything about all the characters. But imagine we didn't, and we learned just about that one character, and we followed just the life of that one character. That's basically third person limited. Um, so it is limited because we don't know about all the characters. So we never learn about Hermione, we'd never learn about Ron, we never learn about Voldemort, etc., etc. And we'd only ever learn about Harry and no one else. That would be an example of third person limited. Disrespect, man, disrespect. Um, Not as important, but an interesting thing to bring up. Um, I guess I'm worth noting this is less important for your exams, but I thought I'd mention it anyway because it's interesting. Um, is that you can get narrators who are reliable and unreliable. So take this with a grain of salt because in exams, reliability of narrators won't necessarily be as important for you. Um, but a narrator can be unreliable. So a reliable narrator is one whose events of the story we can trust. Um, and an unreliable narrator is essentially someone we might not trust for various reasons. And that can make a story all the more interesting if we can't trust the person who's telling us the story. So I won't spend too long on this because it's not as important for you guys. But a reliable narrator is one whose account of the events can be trusted. They present the facts and their perceptions in a clear, consistent, and truthful way. The reader can rely on the narrator's interpretations of events and emotions, as their perspective is logical, consistent, and without deliberate distortion or bias. So while they may have some personal opinions, they generally offer an accurate portrayal of the story. Whereas an unreliable narrator cannot be trusted. They may misinterpret events, hide bits of information, intentionally deceive the reader. Um, and that's not always on purpose. It could be due to things like the mental state of the narrator, the dishonesty, or their lack of knowledge. So the reader must actively question the narrator's version of events, leading to a deeper layer of mystery. I'll show you some examples of some famous unreliable narrations. Um, as I thought. Um, how can I tell if an extract is reliable or unreliable? Now, as I said, I debated putting this in today because with an extract of the length that you'd get in exams, it's very rare that you'd be able to tell or that they would even give you something to do with reliability. I think there's only been one off the top of my head that I can think of where it's kind of been relevant. But I thought it was useful either way just to know. So normally something is unreliable because you'll get things like this. It would make more sense if I show you some examples. Some famous unreliable narrators. Um, Things like Fight Club. If you've ever seen the film Fight Club, it was originally a book. The big twist at the end, sorry to spoil it for anybody, is that the character suffers from a dissociative identity disorder. And so the entire way through the book, you've been following this character who's been claiming that there's other characters in the novel. And at the end, you find out that those other characters never existed because our main character had dissociative identity disorder. And so those other characters just did not exist. And so that's unreliable because of his mental state. Um, if any of you have read the book or the film or seen the film Gone Girl, is about a couple who one partner goes missing and stages the other one for murder. And so both narrators are like giving their sides of the story, but obviously they're biased to sort of support themselves. So you know that it's not the whole truth or the accurate truth because they're both giving different versions of the same story. So you can kind of imply that it's not true. That would be an example of unreliable narration because you don't know who to trust. You don't know who's telling the truth. Um, Again, not to spoil a really famous Agatha Christie novel, but the murder of Roger Ackroyd is actually written from the perspective of the murderer. So obviously that is unreliable because you're following the murderer throughout the entire novel, who's giving you clues that aren't even true or relevant. So that'd be an example of unreliable. The book thief, that'd be reliable narrator. The book thief is more of an abstract one because the narrator in that book is Death himself. Um, I would say that's reliable, um, but that's a nuanced take. That's a nuanced question. The book thief is Death, and you would think that Death would be reliable. I've not read it, so I can't comment precisely, but I know of it. Um, yeah. And then someone like Patrick Bateman, if you've seen American Psycho, he's a massively unstable guy. And so you can't trust someone whose mental state is that bad because you don't know if they're telling you the truth or not. So that would be an example of unreliable narrators. Um, but in exams, you probably wouldn't be given an extract long enough to determine if someone is unreliable or not. Um, it has been done. So it's definitely a point that's relevant, but it's definitely one of those more nuanced things that most people won't think about reliability. So take that with a grain of salt. Um, right. It is on my book list. It is on my book list. That's convincing me to read it. I don't own it, so I've never read it. But it is genuinely up there on my book list. It's meant to be really good. Okay. So think about narration then. A few quick questions and then we'll move on. How does this narration impact the reader? So this is from a book we've looked at before called The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. But that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain and he told the truth mainly. There were things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. What kind of narration type is this? How does it affect the reader, do you think? And how do you think this type of narration serves to enact the writer's intentions? And I've added that last question in because I want you to keep always be thinking about the effects on the reader. Why? This question of why. Why has the writer made this narrative choice? We should always be thinking about why. So, I think is bro smoking a no, he's smoking a pipe. I'm not, I didn't design this. I didn't design this. I don't know. Okay, any idea what type of narration it is first? Ignore reliability for now, just first, third, and if so, what kind? Okay, I'll go through it if no one has any ideas. So it's first person protagonist narration. I should have added. This guy's the main character of our story, so it must be first person. It's first person because um, there he mentions it's a bit more of a difficult one because he doesn't use the word I, but he's talking directly at us, so we can infer it's first person. Um, it tells a story from the main character's point of view, and that's a beneficial thing because it makes the narration feel personal to the reader, therefore kind of gripping you in because you feel connected to the character. And you begin to see the world through their eyes, which creates this feeling of honesty, closeness, and authenticity. The story explores themes of freedom, morality, and growing up, and telling it through Hook's own eyes helps the reader experience the moral journey directly. Because Hook is young and often unsure what's right, the reader has to think for themselves about issues like slavery, society's rules. So Twain's purpose is to challenge the hypocrisy and prejudice in American society. And by giving the first person a voice, it makes those issues feel more real and personal. So it's a really, I guess just to sort of clarify, I know a lot of you probably won't have read this book. It's a book about issues in society. And it's told through the perspective of a young boy who's like growing up and trying to understand the world. And so he's coming across all of these really serious issues and trying to learn right from wrong. So by having it through his eyes, it almost makes it more real for the reader, as if we're the ones that are in the story and we're trying to learn from the issues. Whereas if it was third person, it just wouldn't be as effective. It needs to be through first person to make the writer's intentions work. Because the writer wants the reader to come away having learned something, um, and to be more morally aware. And that just wouldn't happen through third person. Because through first person, you're experiencing the story through their eyes, and it just seems more real and personal. To encourage learning. What type of a word is hook? I don't know. I didn't name these. Why you, what? Okay. And then the other one, this is why I didn't give you the answer before, because this was like one of my questions, A Christmas Carol. Um, but yeah, what type of narration is A Christmas Carol? How does it affect the reader? And again, how do you think it serves the writer's intentions for this specific text? So, um, oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, a covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint. The cold within him froze sore features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait. Any ideas? Someone said a first-person witness. Anyone agree, disagree? You did it in year eight. Do you remember what kind of narration it was? Yeah, it is. It is a type of structure. 'Cause it's who? Who's talking? I went with third person omniscient because it's not from a character's perspective. It's just from a narrator who knows everything. It's describing Scrooge from the outside, but also knows his inner nature and feelings. It's this idea of being all-knowing again, to guide the reader to judge Scrooge. The point of the story, we all know it, A Christmas Carol, is to judge Scrooge and his actions, to get him to be a better person. The ghosts come to him to make him more morally, um, I guess, improved. And that only works through a third person narrative. If we were following through somebody else's eyes, it wouldn't work. It needs to be third person because it creates a distance between the reader and the character. If it was first person, you'd feel more connected to them. You don't want the connection to Scrooge. You want to be distant from him. You want to be able to judge him on his character, like the ghosts do. So Dickens uses an all-knowing narrator to present Scrooge's character and transformation as a moral lesson for the reader. That omniscient voice lets Dickens describe both Scrooge's outer behavior and inner coldness, guiding us to judge him harshly. So it serves Dickens' purpose because, again, he wants us to come away learning. He wants us to see the character of Scrooge and go, okay, we can't be like that. And that only works through third person because we are the judge of that story, if that makes sense. So we'll skip over the narrative choices. I should go into structure. So in an essay, I'd make a very general point of it. I wouldn't really make a specific point on narration. I'd more read the text, think about who's who's speaking, and then make a more general point of it. So I'd say, for example, the narrator is a first person protagonist. Um, Give a quote, some evidence, and I talk about the benefits of that, saying like it makes the reader feel more connected to the character. Therefore, what's the effect on the reader? Same as you would do for any Peter paragraph. I'd always think about the intentions, the writer's intentions, and the reader. Okay, so we can also consider these two things when thinking about who as well. So you might also consider changes in perspective throughout a story. So this is when the point of view changes. And again, this is quite a rare thing for exams, but does happen. So it's always worth noting that the perspective of a story can change um, throughout the story. We also get, or more prevalently and more importantly, changes in attitude, feelings, and thoughts. So this is common to exams and one that you should take strongly, uh, because characters in a story change. They don't stay the same throughout the story because how boring would that be? They have to change in order for the reader to learn something and to make it interesting for the reader. So this is when you get a shift in the character's emotional state, which adds depth to the character development and makes the character's journey more relatable and dynamic. It encourages empathy in the reader and highlights the message of the story. So you should always be considering what might these show you about a character and what impact might they have on the reader. And again, like I said, it's important to consider these, and we'll think about them in more detail now. So, changing perspective then. This won't be a huge thing in extracts of your exams because perspective changes are more whole text kind of thing rather than small extract, but you can still get them in an extract. So what actually is a change in perspective? Well, it's a change in how the character sees the world, themselves or others. It's not just a physical point of view, but it's moral growth, it's emotional, it's mental. And as the events unfold, characters learn. You've never read a book before where the character hasn't learned something or changed in the way that they think or feel. Because that's what makes a story interesting, is change. So why is that actually important? Well, stories are about transformation. Look at Scrooge, for example. The point of the Christmas Carol is that he changes and he learns to be a better person. And if he didn't change, then the story would be pointless and be boring. So it's really important there is this change in perspective. Um, so a protagonist who stays the same is flat, unrealistic, and readers connect with characters who grow and evolve. So it's important. Things you might see are things like um, fear to bravery, selfish to selfless, like Scrooge, naive to wise, dependent to independent, trusting to suspicious, etc., etc. But a change in perspective is just a change in how the character sees the world or themselves. And that can happen, even very minorly. So again, some very common ones, Scrooge. You also think back to Macbeth as well. Macbeth is a good example of a perspective change. He starts off as someone who's quite noble and loyal, but then becomes quite power hungry, paranoid, and consumed by guilt. Holden Caulfield, Catching the Rye, great book, by the way, recommend it to people. Um, he begins being quite cynical and dismissive of the world, but then by the end of the novel, begins to accept that growing up isn't necessarily a bad thing. So there's some examples of perspective changing. What? I'm not getting into that. Um, you should have access to them. I think Mrs. Steaky should have sent you all the links. They are uploaded after the sessions. Horrendous. I'll ask Mrs. Siddiqui then because you should have been, at least your parents should have been sent a link to all of these. Yeah. Anyway, change your feelings and thoughts then. So this happens more often in text. So this is when a character's thoughts and feelings change throughout the text. And that does happen in an extract. It's important because it shows development in that character, and tells you something about the story and that character. So it just helps us to understand the character a little better, understanding emotions, motivations, fears, desires, creating that emotional engagement between us and the characters, building tension and conflict. So I guess I should really highlight this one because this is sort of the most prevalent or common um, result that you'd get from a change in thoughts and feelings. So, for example, I think people who've been with me a while know that I tend to use the dinosaur text from 2018 because it's a good example of a change in thoughts and feelings. So the characters start off as quite brave and then they end up in like sheer panic. So that's a good example of a change in feelings and thoughts. Um, yeah, and I think that's really good because it shows tension. If a character suddenly becomes quite scared and unnerved, as a reader, we also therefore feel that suspense and tension. So yeah, a change in feelings and thoughts is important. And it often reflects the writer's message as well. Um, I guess it's worth noting that a character's changing thoughts and feelings draw the reader into the journey. Just makes it more believable for us, we feel more connected, and it helps the writer to communicate a sort of moral theme and sort of emotional truth. Off then. Um, and I just wanted to remind you also of the extract level techniques that we discussed as well, because a lot of these do count as who, if we are thinking about them. I won't go over them too much detail because we did go over them last week, um, or at least the week before, but we can relate a lot of these techniques or structural devices to who. So, for example, a stream of consciousness. That's when we get a long spiel of text just from the character's perspective. So they start telling us all of the thoughts, all of the feelings that they're having, all of their motivations. That's a stream of consciousness, and that's technically who, because we're learning about that character. Fragmentation tends to be first person as well, relating to who. Um, that's when we get changing and chopping thoughts. So we get a very quick change of thoughts between characters. And that tends to convey things like disorientation, urgency, trauma. Listening as well tells us a lot about a character, as does repetition and anaphora. But pacing is probably most important. Because the way in which the character tells the story tells us a lot about that character. If you've got a quite fast-paced telling of a story, it tells you that character is maybe anxious, in a state of urgency, panic, possibly excitement. Whereas if they take the story quite slow in the way that it's being told, that helps to build the tension, the sadness, the intimacy, almost encourage a sense of reflection from the reader. So all of these can be linked back to the narration type as well. Um, and then it's worth saying as well, punctuation. Think about our sentence types from last week. The different punctuation that you used is going to tell you something different about how that character is thinking and feeling. If they're using exclamatory phrases, that tells you that they're clearly feeling some strong emotion, whether that's surprise, anger, excitement. Equally, if they've posed a question, that suggests that they're maybe uncertain, that they're curious, that they're tense. Um, but then also you get the other punctuation as well. Let me see what's going on in the chat here. Um, is that yeah, yeah, I will be. I actually will be an invigilator on that. Oh, I don't. I've been called an invigilator. That sounds too old. Yeah, yeah. So my plan for next week is to look at a text and work it through step by step, looking at model answers and how you would answer an AQA text question. Yeah. So yeah, I've got you covered on that already. Um, I'll move on because of time. I do want to get through who. So the last thing to consider when you're thinking about who is introductions to new characters. You will find this a lot in AQA or EdExcel or EDUCAT or OCR texts, is that they'll often give you an extract where there'll be other characters introduced throughout that text. And so it's important to consider when these characters come into play and how and if they and why they're important. Because new characters always enter a story for a specific reason. They're never introduced for no reason. They always have a purpose. So new characters may enter the story midway through. And that could be for various reasons. That could be to introduce conflict, it could be to show emotional states, it could be to show challenges. But it adds a level of depth to the story in addition to the protagonist's experiences. So we should always be considering when new characters are entering a story. And I'll show you some examples of that now. So I'm not going to read this full because we did do this one last week. But we looked at this text. If you remember back, it was the one about the guy who sees the woman in the graveyard. Um, I've used this because, and then I saw her. It introduces a new character. It's about a guy walking through a graveyard. He comes across a ghostly woman in a graveyard. Yeah. So the introduction here is that the protagonist is our male character, but it's the ghostly woman gets introduced midway through this extract. So you could talk about that in an exam. Say that a new character has entered, but you need to consider why that is. So in this example that we looked at last week, the introduction of the mysterious young woman immediately changes the mood and builds suspense. That's the reason that this woman has been introduced. So up until this point, the narrator's tone is calm and reflective. The woman's sudden appearance introduces tension and a sense of the supernatural. Her silvery clothing, loose hair, and pale, distressed face makes her seem ghostly, which unsettles both the narrator and the reader. And the growing coldness adds to this eerie, haunting atmosphere and forebodes to something sinister. Her arrival also shifts the focus from the narrator's observation of the setting to an emotional, almost fearful reaction. So it's important. The reason that she's come into play is to make the reader feel tension, to feel uneasy. Um, so that could be one example of why you add someone in. Um, so what structural technique is adding new characters? Introduction to new characters. I'd call it that. You could talk about it as a change in focus if you wanted to, but you could equally just say a new character has been introduced. That's the technique. I think a lot of people struggle with structural devices because they are just on the nose. Like there isn't a special name for this, it just is the introduction to new characters. And you'd get marks for that in terminology in an exam. Equally, I will read this one through. It's from a book called War of the Worlds, great book as well if you haven't read it. Um, I'll read this through. There's a young boy is introduced in this story, and I want you to think about as I'm reading it, why? Why has the narrator or the writer chosen to include this very minor character? Because sometimes it won't be as obvious as this one here. There's a really lengthy description of that woman in the graveyard. She's quite a big part of this story. But in this one, you get a young boy who's a very minor part of the story. Like he's basically like non-existent, but he's still been put there for a reason. So, when I returned to the common, the sun was setting. Scattered groups were hurrying from the direction of Woking, and one or two persons were returning. The crowd around the pit had increased and stood out black against the lemon of the sky. A couple of hundred people, perhaps. There were raised voices, and some sort of struggle appeared to be going on about the pit. Strange imaginings passed through my mind. As I drew nearer, I heard Stent's voice. Keep back, keep back. A boy came running towards me. It's a moving, he said to me as he passed. A screw in and a screwing out, and I don't like it. I'm going home, I am. I went to the crowd. They were really, I should think, 200 or 300 people elbowing and jostling one another. The one or two ladies there being by no means the least active. So notice in this very short extract, a child was introduced very briefly, was still brought into this. Why do you think that is? Why do you think this young minor character has been put in there, even for a very short, brief amount of time? Any ideas? I should say the story is about aliens, and an alien has just crash landed in a field, by the way. That's what everyone's jostling over. Any ideas before I go through it? Okay, I'll go through this as an example. So, even though the character is only a very small part of the story, it's still important because the brief introduction of the boy helps to increase the tension, almost filling out the world of the scene. Let's see. Put. Yeah, fills out the world of the scene. So his words show that something strange and threatening is happening at the pit before the narrator or the reader can see it. You've got to think of it logically. We don't know as a reader what's happening. We just know that there's a bunch of people around the pit. So in our heads, we're trying to work out what's to come and what's actually happening because we haven't been told as a reader. What we have been told is what the boy has told us. And so his words show or forebode to something later, and that builds suspense. The boy's reaction gives an early warning to the danger, making the reader feel anxious to find out what is moving. Because the boy is young and frightened, his fear feels innocent and instinctive, which makes it more convincing and unsettling. His decision to run home contrasts with the crowd's curiosity, highlighting their foolishness and foreshadowing the chaos to come. So I guess it just fills out the world. It gives realism to the story. Um, and again, it's important to why he's been included. But always think about why a character has been introduced, because there was always a reason. And in this sense, for the young boy, it's to build suspense. It's to give us as the reader something to think about before being told it directly. Therefore, engaging us. Right, will I go over this one? I will leave this one for you to have a look at in your when you have the presentation. I won't go over this one. I will very briefly discuss setting with you. So we've talked about who. Now we talk about where. Um, where is the setting? Where is the story actually set? So when you think about the setting, you need to think about these things. How is it described and does it change? Most of the time, setting won't necessarily change, but it is important to think about how it is described and where the story is actually set, because that is structure. The reason that's important is because it sets the atmosphere, often reflects the sort of themes of the story and driving the plot. So we always need to be thinking about how does it make the reader feel and how does it make the character feel? So here are some examples of very general settings. Firstly, let's think about something like a graveyard, something that's quite isolated, that's quite ominous, that's quite scary. That's going to have a very different effect to something like a marketplace, because a graveyard is going to make you feel quite tense, quite uneasy, quite anxious and unsettled, almost forebode to something sinister and supernatural. Whereas a marketplace is going to make the reader feel a very different way. It's comfort, it's happiness, excitement. It's a lot more of a warmer feeling than something like a graveyard. Equally, something like War of the Worlds, you get this like chaotic environment. That's more suspense, urgency, fear, anticipation. And then you could have maybe um, more isolated places like a forest might convey loneliness, vulnerability, make you feel quite reflective as a character. So setting is important because it changes the way that the reader feels and understands the story, if that makes sense. So yeah, setting is important. I do have to say though, where is probably the least important of all of our who, what, why, where, when. Because where is just plainly settings, where the story is set. It's not really that vital to structure, but you should always consider it, especially if it changes. Because if a setting changes, For example, if the story is on a train and then the characters get off the train, that's a change in setting. And that again will be done on purpose to convey certain things. Okay, right. So I think let me rush through the story arc, and that'll be our time done. So we'll finish off when next time. But I do very briefly want to mention to you the story arc. You'll be familiar with the story arc. But this is the general structure of any story. It will start with our exposition. It will then move to the inciting incident, then to the rising action, the climax, falling action, resolution. And I love this diagram because it is kind of apt. Um, a story is like a roller coaster. It begins quite flat and then builds and builds and builds and builds towards a big drop. And then when a climax happens, everything begins to accelerate until you reach the end of the story. So I really like this example, this analogy, because it is very, I don't know, like well lit. So in terms of the story arc, you should always be considering where in the story the extract in the exam is set. And normally it will tell you. So, at the top of an exam, you get that little like 2 sentence description. Normally in there, it will tell you where the story is from out of the text. So normally it will say something like, this extract is from the beginning of a 17th century novel. So because it says beginning, you know it's the exposition. Equally, it might tell you that it was taken midway through. So you can probably infer its rising action or climax. So always look at that little description box because it tells you structurally where we are in the story that the extract has been taken from. Um, Now, I think it's worth mentioning that in an exam situation, these two are the ones that come up the most. I don't think I've ever actually seen an extract from the end of a story. It normally is from either the exposition or rising action. It can happen. They could theoretically give you one from the end of the novel, but 9 times out of 10, it's going to be from one of these two places in the story arc because they're the ones that you can build character and context and stake. So they're easier to analyze, I guess. So I said the examiners will most likely give you an extract from either of these 2 points, possibly the climax, but most likely the exposition and rising action. So if we think about these two then, um, just for a slight moment, and then I will let you go for the evening. Exposition just means the start of the story. So this is setting the stage for the entire story. It provides the key background information, introduces the setting, provides the characters, and tells us what the conflict is going to be for that story. This is the part of the story that gives us answers to the questions like, who are the main characters? Where and when does the story take place? What is the world like? What is the initial problem or conflict that drives the narrative? And the exposition is important because it helps the audience to understand the context of the story, prepares them for the unfolding drama. It typically occurs in the very early parts of a story. So yeah, I do think like normally in an exam, I would say most of the extracts are taken from the exposition. Um, yeah, because they're good to analyze, because you can learn who the characters are. You can get to grips with what the conflict is in a story. Um, but equally, you could get the inciting incident or the rising action. And these, I think, are more fun and interesting to analyze because they show tension, they convey suspense. So the inciting incident is basically a part of the story where something happens to push along the events of the story. So it's something that happens to disrupt the status quo, to propel the story. It's a moment that sparks the conflict in the story, prompting the protagonist to take action. Without this incident, the plot would lack momentum as it gives characters a reason to move forward. Equally, that pushes the story into the rising action. This is the longest section of any story, and it's where the plot develops and the tension builds. The protagonist tends to face challenges and obstacles here that prevent them from achieving their goal. The stakes get higher, the conflict intensifies, and the motivations of the character are explored. Twists and turns occur, and the characters are forced to make decisions towards the climax. I think these are most interesting to analyze because in the rising action, high energy, high impact things tend to take place. So in the dinosaur example I mentioned earlier, that's from the rising action because they get chased by a dinosaur. So yeah, could be from that part of a story, but it's always worth thinking about where in the story the extract is actually taken from, because that will change what the reader takes away from the story, basically. Um, cool. Right. Um, I will let that be for today then. I will stay around for a couple of minutes in case anyone has any more questions, for me, English related, of course. Otherwise, have a lovely week, guys, and I will see some of you this week. Otherwise, have a nice week, guys. What's my favorite type of sandwich? You know what? That's a good question, that. If we're talking Subway, I tend to get like the I don't know. I don't really eat sandwiches that much. I'm gonna be really honest with you. That's not unless I'm going to Subway or something like that. Thanks. Have you got any English related questions? I will assume not. Okay then. Right. I will assume there's nothing for me. Um, yeah, have a nice week, guys. I will see some of you this week. As always, if you have any questions, bring them to me in these sessions. We don't have to go through things that I want to go through. We can just go through whatever you guys are struggling with. But otherwise, I will leave you there. And have a lovely week, everyone.